Hi, I'm Dr. Howard Zucker, the doc in Docology. Today, we're diving into a topic which is at the intersection between health, national security, and global stability. We often think of threats to our safety in terms of weapons and wars and terrorism, but pandemics and biological attacks and emerging infectious diseases can be just as devastating, if not more so. In fact, we've seen that with COVID. So our guest today is Dr. Ken Bernard. He's the retired Rear Admiral of the United States Public Health Service, a distinguished fellow today at the Stanford University, and he created the team on health security from inside the White House for President Bill Clinton, and then again for George W. Bush. He's been a senior health advisor to cabinet members, to senators, to Director General of the World Health Organization. And from smallpox debates to bioterror readiness to global health crises, he's really been at the center of it all. And today, we're going to hear his perspectives on health security and whether we're ready for what comes next, and also what keeps Ken Bernard up at night. So, Dr. Bernard, I've known him for 24 years now, and he's been a true mentor to me. So welcome, Ken. It's good to have you here today. And I thought maybe we could start right at the beginning on an issue. You were there as one of the earliest voices inside government making the case that health is a national security issue. So that idea wasn't really widely accepted back then, going back, 20, 25 years or so. And it wasn't even that highly accepted inside the White House. So I was wondering, what was it that made you realize that this health threat or health threats are as much as military threats out there for our security? And then how did you convince people that they should be thinking of it that way as well?
Well, thanks, Howard. You're right. I think I first met you not long after 9/11 at the Department of Health and Human Services, where I was running an office of health and security for Secretary Tommy Thompson. But that's actually a few years after this whole discussion of health and security first started. Back in 1998, during the Clinton administration, Donna Shalala was the health secretary. And Donna Shalala, who you may know very well, who since was a congresswoman from Florida. She was health secretary for Bill Clinton for 8 years. And I had had long conversations while I was health attaché at the U.S. mission to the United Nations in Geneva, the World Health Organization, about how health is actually broader than just dealing with people's individual diseases, but actually could impact cultures, society, civilizations across the world, across both Europe, the United States, Asia, everywhere. And she decided at the time, based on our discussions, to send me over to work at the National Security Council in Washington at the White House. And so she called up Sandy Berger, who was the National Security Advisor. Were close friends, and said, Sandy, I'm sending you the health person. You're putting him on the National Security Council staff. He's going to deal with health as a security issue. And Sandy, being smart enough to not argue with the inestimable Donna Shalala, said, yes, ma'am, I'll do that. No one had any idea why in 1998 health was a security issue. And I had to basically spend the 2 years in the Clinton administration trying to convince people that health was a security issue. And it was an uphill battle.
What made you successful at that, to get them to see the perspective that this is a real issue? Or was it an event that occurred that was the trigger or the catalyst for that?
It was mostly at the time HIV/AIDS, because as you may recall, HIV/AIDS was devastating an entire segment of the population in Africa. All the mothers and fathers of all the small children were dying in record numbers in Africa, leaving small children, teenage boys, etc., to their own devices to be cared for by their grandparents if they had them, or otherwise join gangs, militias, illegal activity, because they were in large numbers not being parented. They had no families anymore because AIDS had wiped out the sexually active part of many African populations. And so there was some concern in the national security community that this kind of free roaming, unsupervised young men, especially, would be joining political militias and destabilizing countries, which was not in anyone's security's best interest.
Well, are we headed back a little bit towards the way it was before? I was just thinking about this when you mentioned about issues HIV/AIDS, and it's a global issue, and then we don't have USAID anymore, and things have changed. Are we sort of setting ourselves up for some of those problems again, or do you think things are in place strong enough to prevent that from happening, given the 20 years of 25 years since?
Well, back then, the paradigm for international health was the humanitarian paradigm. It was the poor countries that needed assistance. USAID was created in order to help the poor countries, health issues, saving children, improving health. And the paradigm began to shift to talk about health as more of a national security issue, which involved both developed and developing countries. If there were destabilized countries around the world because of health reasons, COVID was a good example of that happening actually in more recent years, then it would also affect the economies, cultures, security of the developed countries. And I think that that paradigm shift has basically completed. It's taken 20 years, and now people do look at health not just as rich countries helping poor countries, but global health being a common interest of both rich, poor, North and Southern countries.
Well, it seems that over the period of time between the Clinton administration, they had a team for health security, and then it was gone, and they had a team again for health security. It seems like it came and went a lot. But and it's, I guess
it's
that's just
been,
yeah,
it's been basically my entire career is trying to maintain the idea that health is a security issue. So back in 1998, we finally convinced the national security realm, at least the National Security Advisor, that health was a security issue. And he wrote about it. He was convinced. Then the Bush administration came in 2021, and they immediately abolished the National Security Office of Health and Security, saying it really wasn't a health issue. Then 9/11 happened. Then the anthrax attacks, if you recall, in the fall of 2001 happened, and Tom Ridge, who had been called into the White House, the governor of Pennsylvania, to be the Bush's Homeland Security advisor, called me up and said, we need to open an office of health and security at the White House. And I'll give you 5 people to help you. So from nothing, we went to an office to deal with the potential of bioterrorism, et cetera, as emblematic as and the anthrax attacks were representative of. And so then we went all through the Bush administration with health and security being a directorate at the National Security Council. And then the Obama administration came in, and I said, oh, well, you know, Democrats, they're really big on health and issues. They'll support this. They abolished the office too. And they reestablished it after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, if you recall, 10 years ago. Then the Trump administration came in, and they abolished it again. Not a national security issue. Then it got reestablished again. And the Trump administration, the Biden administration reestablished it again. And then the Trump administration kept the Office of Health and Security at the White House, to their credit. And it is there again today. It's unfortunately only got 2 or 3 people in it, in the office. And so like many of the offices in the current White House at the NSC, they really suffered from significant downsizing. But at least the office is still there.
So with the downsizing and everything, how prepared would we as a nation be if there was another biological threat? Because whether natural threat or a deliberate one, either way, would we be ready to address it? Because I remember with anthrax, you were saying it was really important when we were working on that on the Hill. You said everyone needs to work together on these kind of public health crises.
Yeah. Um, Here's the problem. National security people are not that interested in doing health. If they'd been interested in health, they would have gone to the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health or Harvard or someplace. Instead, they're much more interested in binational confrontational politics. Just look at the last 2 weeks, for example. The national security crowd is far more interested, and rightfully so in this particular case, in what's going on in the Middle East than dealing with a potential for a future health threat. But the problem is, an example is back when in the Bush administration, I was briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of all of the military services, and on the threat of bioterrorism. And I used one of my standard arguments, which I don't use much anymore, which is more people died in the 20th century from smallpox than all of the wars, including civilian deaths combined. World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. And the generals, I thought, would be taken aback, go, wow, we didn't realize health was so important. But the comment I got back from one of the service chiefs was, well, Doc, it looks like we did a pretty damn good job in the 20th century and you health people didn't.
And is that why you're not? Is that why you're not using that argument anymore?
That's why I'm not using the argument anymore. I discovered that coming at it from the health point of view to try to convince somebody whose job wasn't health was not working. And from that point onward, for example, when I was at the White House in the Bush administration, my name tag on the door didn't have doctor, MD, any of my degrees. All it said was Kenneth Bernard, Special Assistant to the President, because that's what carried the weight, not my technical degrees. People with technical degrees in health almost always sit in the second row.
Because they're just viewed as wonky, they're just viewed too much as like just a policy person.
Well, what happened was health people can be really arrogant, especially public health people, as we've discovered in the pushback against the way we dealt with COVID, right? They have a tendency to say, we know what's best. You guys just don't have the training to be able to tell us what to do and what's the right thing to do. And it turns out that important people make the most important decisions. I mean, you were working for a governor, you were working for a secretary, you saw this all the time in your career. If you tell somebody that they're not smart enough or capable enough to make an important decision, they immediately categorize that decision as less important. If you go to them and say, well, this issue about smallpox or this issue about Ebola is too complex, you don't let me make it, and I'll just tell you what the right decision is because it's about a health issue. They'll immediately decide it's not an important issue because they make all the important decisions. And that's something you need to consider when you're a public health person talking to political people.
So is that ego versus fact? Is that what's really happening? It's like you offending their ego a little bit, and then they'd rather push back a little bit on that.
A little bit, but mostly it's the difference between policy and science. So the public health people say, oh, well, my policy is completely informed by science. But the political people know that's just not the case. If you decide there's an outbreak of something in a public school, for example, and a bunch of kids are getting sick with some rash illness, and some of them have been hospitalized, and you go to the principal comes to the public health people and say, should we close the school? And the public health person will say, well, yes, because you're going to transmit too much disease if you keep the school open, and we don't know what it is, and we need to take care of it. On the other hand, the mayor may say, wait a minute, if we close the schools, what about the other schools? What about the parents who are taking care of those kids? If you close the schools, the parents can't go to work, most of them, to take care of their kids. It has much broader social impact than just the public health impact of closing the school. So what happens is the scientists, especially the public health people, think that the science should drive everything. But those of us who did policy for all these years realized that science doesn't drive policy, it informs policy. Policy is impacted by many factors other than just the raw science.
Well, we saw this with COVID because the whole issue of the schools was what do we do at that point in time? And you raised it right there. It's like if you close the school, who's watching these kids at home? Who's leaving their job and then ending up having to stay home? And then what if they lose their job? And so it's a big social issue. You mentioned smallpox, and I wanted to bring this up because you helped lead the fight to keep that smallpox virus, which we have in Atlanta, obviously in a very secure lab, but you prevented that from being destroyed. And I think that's a fascinating chapter, given all the worries about bioterrorism and everything. Can you walk us through a little bit about how you were able to do that? Because that is an enormous decision that was made, not only for the United States, but for the world.
Well, as you know, as I said before, smallpox was one of the biggest killers of mankind of any infectious disease. It killed billions of people over the years, wiped out whole populations. And luckily, back 300 years ago, believe it or not, or 250 years ago, somebody invented a vaccine, the first vaccine really, against smallpox. It's the old Jenner story of vaccinating, noticing that milking maids did not ever get smallpox, and it's because they got infected with a pox virus from the cows which they were milking. They developed a vaccine using the pustules from cowpox, which was the disease of the cows, and they started immunizing people hundreds of years ago for smallpox. The fact is, however, that most of the world was not immunized for a long time. Eventually, the World Health Organization led a big campaign to vaccinate as many people in the world and to eliminate the disease. And by 1978, smallpox had been eliminated through vaccination throughout the world. The last case was in 1978. And actually 77 in the wild, 78 in the laboratory. And eventually people stopped vaccinating. And they decided to destroy all of the smallpox viruses that people had in their laboratories over the years, just so that they couldn't get out and start another outbreak in smallpox in people who were no longer being vaccinated. But what happened was the World Health Organization called for the destruction of the final 2 stocks of smallpox virus, one in Russia and one in the United States. And we were, at the time at the White House, very concerned that if the United States destroyed the last remaining research stocks of smallpox, that the only ones left would be the Russians. And anybody else who happened to keep them and not destroy them in the days when they were supposed to have destroyed all of the laboratory stocks. And we were afraid that we would be the only country that didn't have smallpox in case we needed it to develop different vaccines or different drugs in the future.
And going on with the World Health Organization for a minute, because we've had huge changes. In the United States didn't show up at the World Health Assembly this year. WHO is still the key international agency if there is some kind of outbreak. And you and I both were there. What do you think is going to happen with this whole issue with WHO and just global health and the United States' role in making sure that we have our eyes and ears on the world for potential another biological threat?
Well, the smallpox, let me just quickly finish the smallpox story, and that is that so what we did is we got President Clinton to declare that we would not be destroying the smallpox stocks that we had in the United States against the request of the World Health Organization. And we gave good reasons for that. And to this day, we still have a stock, very, very secure stock there. And we know the Russians still have their stocks. And we also are reasonably sure that there are stocks in other countries as well. We're just keeping them in case we might need them in the future. But the idea of using national security as a reason to not make a public display of destroying the research stocks was very important politically and to this whole idea of health as a security issue. Now, with regards to WHO, I've said it before, withdrawing from WHO is just not the right thing to do. You could have, if the United States wanted to put pressure on WHO, they should have stayed in the organization and just withheld funding. The United States paid about $120 million a year in assessed budget and another close to $1 billion a year in voluntary money to various programs like malaria or HIV or whatever. And the voluntary money, they could have stopped anytime they wanted. It was every year they decided to give it or not. The assessed money of $120 million kept us with a seat at the table to not only have insight into what other countries were doing, but also not let WHO do things that would cause us difficulties on the international scene. It was just a bad idea, in my opinion.
So what worries you now about sort of biological threats that you'd want WHO to look at, or the United States to look at, or the office that you led look at? I mean, what's out there that we should be thinking about?
Well, there are two things. One is legacy threats are still a threat. If you wanted to attack Washington, D.C. with anthrax, you don't need a lot of high-tech stuff to do that. We're lucky that nobody's decided they want to do something like that for reasons that are a little bit opaque. But the biggest threats that we see now have to do with the potential for bioengineering and biotechnology to increase the ability of people to make new threats, create chimeric viruses where you combine smallpox with flu or whatever it is that you're trying to do, or genetically change a known virus like, say, flu and make it more transmissible or more virulent or more deadly, using genetic engineering or other techniques. And how do you predict that? And how do you prepare for that? You know, it's easy enough to get enough antibiotics to treat 100 million people for anthrax, or to immunize everybody in the United States for smallpox if you need to. But how do you predict what to develop countermeasures for when you don't even know what the bad actor is going to do with either a known virus or a new virus they create on their own?
Would we be able to mount a serious defense without sort of all our global partners? I mean, we're pretty strong. The country's got a lot of infrastructure, but would we know something's happening just because we have enough eyes and ears on the ground, even if it's not a formal relationship, or do we still, should we be worried about that?
We should be worried about it. I mean, cutting down a lot of the research on surveillance for new viruses and other organisms that could potentially be threats is a problem. We should have eyes and ears on the ground in these countries. We need friends. We need allies. We need people who we are working with in those countries that can warn us when they see something odd. Being isolationist, this has been said many times before, viruses and bacteria don't obey political boundary lines and sovereign boundary lines, country boundaries. They don't care where the red line is on the map. And so we have to deal with it. Just like that happened in Ebola when some Ebola cases came to the United States and shut down a couple of cities out of fear and our ability to respond to a new virus that we haven't seen in this country.
Yeah, and I remember with Ebola, because as the commissioner, it really created panic a little bit in the city when we had one person in the city with Ebola, and the worry that spread across the whole city, the state, and obviously the country in many ways. If you've advised presidents, you've advised so many people. If you had the opportunity now to advise the president, what would be some of the things that you would mention regarding national health security issues that we should be doing as a country, or in general we should be doing internally or externally?
It's all about leadership. We have the best technical ability in the world, really, although China's creeping up on us pretty quickly. I'm not worried about our scientific ability. What I'm worried about is whether or not we see it as a priority. We need to develop at the White House, because this is, by the way, a multi-sectoral issue. The Defense Department, the EPA, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, CDC, NIH, FDA, they all have a piece of biosecurity and biodefense. And the only way you can really have oversight and planning for that is to have an office above all of them that can call the meetings and do the interagency work necessary to prepare. And I think what they need is a very senior person at the White House. I've said this multiple times in multiple publications, actually. They need a deputy assistant to the president in charge of health security that is in charge of making sure that the agencies that have different responsibilities, agriculture and EPA and defense, don't have similar mandates. Their jobs are different, but they all have a piece of the biosecurity portfolio. And should be managed out of an office at the White House, at the National Security Council, so that it's seen as a security issue. And this person should be the person that, if I walked into any university anywhere and said, who's running biosecurity for the United States, who's in charge, they would say, oh, there's a guy at the White House, his name is, Mary Beth Jones or whatever, that's in charge. And we don't have that now. We have somebody who's in the job, sort of, but it hasn't been raised to a high enough level, I don't think, to be able to manage this large potential problem.
Do you think all of these changes that are happening will help or hurt? Because I remember when we were in the federal government, the Homeland Security Department, you mentioned Tom Ridge, the Homeland Security Department started, and there was a lot of confusion then, and there were a lot of moving of agencies, and ultimately it all sorted itself out. And now they're doing all these changes at HHS, and getting rid of advisory committees, and USAID, it's been defunded. Do you think all these changes will ultimately, it'll shake itself out, and what you're just mentioning about biosecurity will come to play, or is it just too early to tell?
Well, one can agree or disagree with how the government's being reorganized. I think the United States is pretty resilient against this kind of change. And I think downsizing a lot of the offices was probably a good idea. Things were getting pretty out of control as far as numbers. But like I said, it's about leadership. And it has to be seen as driven by the top. This administration, more than any, is top down. Than any in my career anyway, where the front office, at the White House, really sets the agenda pretty firmly. And I think we can work within that. I mean, it's not impossible at all. It's a big change, and I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of us who've worked under different structures. But I think it can be done, so long as the top realizes that it's important and that they put somebody in the job that takes responsibility for the issue. And health security, as we saw with COVID, is as massive an issue as internationally and security-wise as any issue we face, including the ones now in the Middle East for us. So we need to take it seriously, and we need to take it seriously between the events. The typical problem with national security people is we'll deal with it when it pops up. Oh, we have Ebola, we have COVID, we need to change everything and pay attention to it. But thank God that's over. We can get back to what we like to do, which is, NATO affairs or China affairs or whatever. So what we need is somebody senior enough to say, I'm going to run this issue between the crises. And we know there'll be new ones. There's always a new health crisis. For the history of the United States, for the history of mankind, there's been a health crisis intermittently, as far as I know, back in history. The question is, what's the next one going to be? And we need to prepare in the interregnum, in between the crises. We need to set up a system that can respond quickly to those crises, so we don't end up having to shut down the United States like we did with COVID completely until we could figure things out.
So when they go around the table, they have to have a chance to share what their concern is on the public health. When people are discussing all these other health security issues, they say, okay, what's on your list today that you're concerned about? And make sure it's a high priority. We've been talking about government. What role do you think the private sector should play in all of this? Because we've got big pharma, we've got bio, we've got cyber issues now. Like, what role should they play in national health security?
Well, you have to remember that back when I started getting involved in this 25 years ago, the private sector wanted nothing to do with it. And you may even remember some of the tech companies like Meta and it was Facebook and Google. As soon as they got involved with national security things, their own employees objected and they pulled back. But things have changed in the last few years. There have been a number of companies, Palantir and Anduril and others, that are getting involved in actually the national security intersection with the cyber world and the IT world. And I think it's also happening in the biotechnology area as well. Back in the day, the health people thought that the national security focus was a betrayal. My biggest difficulties were dealing with people at CDC and WHO about why health needed to be a security issue. And they believed that was the entirely wrong focus. So we've seen the antipathy towards the private sector and the national security realm altogether change over the last 5 or maybe 10 years at the most.
So you think Ebola, COVID, every time one of these things pops up, it makes more and more people realize we need to be thinking about this more and not be so siloed in the way they're thinking about issues.
It was the humanitarian approach to public health, international health versus the national security approach, and there was a shift that happened. I was at the very beginning of it. It was a shift that happened during the last 25 years.
Well, you start with HIV/AIDS. That's how you started when we started to talk about this. That's how it began.
And remember, it started back then. The only entree we had, that was during the Clinton administration. During the Bush administration, it was all about countering bioterrorism because of the anthrax attacks. Remember all the letters that had the powder in them back in the day, and everybody was afraid of opening their mail and all of that. So the original work that we did was health as a biosecurity risk related to its use as a bioterrorism weapon. And it slowly with the outbreaks in the natural world, the flu outbreaks, the Ebola outbreak, the COVID outbreak, people started seeing it much more as a generalized health security issue, not just a bioterrorist issue.
And even SARS, the original, the SARS outbreak in 2004, that was another one that people started to get really concerned about. And I remember when, after anthrax, that's when the secretary decided to build that whole command center, right? They decided we need to build a place for everyone to have all the information come in so that we could tackle this. What are 3 takeaways because we want to go to our audience and ask them questions, what are 3 takeaways when it comes to health and security that we should make sure everyone's aware of?
Our security has as a component our communal health security as an important part. COVID was a perfect example. I mean, the impact of a new virus was extreme. I mean, I remember, Howard, when you called me once, March or April of 2020, from a hospital up on Long Island somewhere, out in Queens or somewhere, where you said it was a 125-bed community hospital. It had 185 patients in it. 85% of them were on ventilators, and most of them were going to die. We now have freezer trucks because the morgue is overflowing with people who've died.
It was terrible. It was terrible. It was Queens. I remember this. Yeah.
People don't remember the impact of those first 3 months of COVID on our society. And I think now in retrospect, they're going, oh, we overreacted, whatever. But if you were in a decision-making position, how would you have dealt with that? You had to do it. as commissioner. So, you know, I didn't envy you at the time. I don't envy you in retrospect. And I think a lot of people have forgotten how serious a health threat like that can be to our, broadly to our culture. Is the leadership issue.
Yeah, it was back to what you were talking about. It was a terrible time, and I think that people don't realize how much, how many people were dying, and how serious this whole situation was, and that's why I was talking about what could happen, what would happen if something happened again. And a lot of times, people's memories start to like fade, and they don't realize how terrible something was. So that's 2 points. Any other key points you think that the takeaway? I mean, you mentioned
the leadership issue. We need to have leadership on this issue at the White House in between the inevitable next pandemic threat. And that's a critical governance issue. And the other is we better not let our basic research into biotechnology fade. China is beginning to kick our ass on this because they are funding development of new biotechnology, both for good and potentially for evil reasons. And we need to make sure that we keep up and that we're still the leader in the world on development of biotechnology. Because if we have a new threat like COVID, we last time developed a new vaccine in 11 months, unheard of. You have to give President Trump credit for that. And we ended up with a new vaccine. We need to have a system available if a new threat pops up, especially a genetically engineered threat or a new bio threat that was created intentionally, to be able to deal with developing a countermeasure in real time, not in 2 or 3 or 5 years.
You mentioned basic research, and I know we want to go to the audience and questions, but I just want to ask you a question about this. Are we losing scientists now to other countries, or will we be losing scientists to other countries, or do you think that we'll be able to maintain the expertise right here in America?
I think we'll be able to maintain it here. I don't know many scientists who want to uproot themselves and move. Now, some young scientists may move. If you have no real roots and you're a postdoc or something, I could easily see moving to Switzerland or Belgium or someplace. And it is a risk, but I think I'm not worried about that. I think being a scientist at Stanford or Harvard is still top of my list.
Still impressive, and still they have the funding and the research to do what you want to do.
No, they can make a big difference. I mean, if they start dramatically cutting funding, people will still follow the money. So it is a risk. And if we're competing with China, and we are in this area, we ought to think twice before we cut our basic funding for biotechnology.
And China will just keep throwing more and more money into this. And
yep.
And some of the rules and regulations are not there that we keep in place.
Yeah, we can put all the rules about gain of function research on Americans, and people just move to India or China to do the research. Why not? Companies will do that. Scientists will do that.
Right. So this is the point where we go to our audience and ask them what questions they have. I always bring up at this point to make sure everyone realizes the podcast is primarily for informational purposes. If there's any medical questions that come up, you should always ask your doctor, although our subject today has been pretty much on a high level national security and health security issues. Kat, who do we have? And you're usually the first person who comes up with the question. So Kat, what's your question tonight?
So I'm actually going to ask a question that we got from a subscriber, and you touched on this a little bit, but their question was, how should we collaborate with countries we don't trust, like China or Russia, on disease detection? Maybe there's an example. Obviously, COVID is the one that comes to mind. That's a good example, but that is their question. How should we collaborate with countries we're not super fond of and probably aren't super fond of us either?
Great question.
Well, there's 2 kinds of collaboration. There's country-to-country collaboration, and there's scientist-to-scientist collaboration. Now, the country-to-country collaboration always ends up being very political. I've had personally extensive dealings with the Iranians, for example, over international health regulations and such in Geneva, where we negotiate for weeks and weeks and weeks to no great end. But that's not what I think we really need so much. What we really need is scientists to be able to talk to each other. Most of the information that we got about, say, the Russian smallpox program was based on scientist-to-scientist collaboration with their smallpox scientists. Even when we weren't politically talking to Russia about these issues, the scientists still talk to each other because that's what they do, right? There's been somehow in recent years some pushback against doing that, especially with the Chinese, especially related to COVID and gain of function. But I think it's a little bit overblown. I think the scientists there, if they want to do bad stuff, they don't need us.
Great question, great answer. I do remember during COVID, as a cardiologist, I spoke to my cardiology colleagues in other parts of the world, and they would share more information than sometimes you could get through other channels. So yes, scientists will talk to each other and doctors will talk to each other.
Especially not in formal sessions. You know, they'll talk to each other in the hallways at a conference and that kind of thing. You know, we knew more about what was going on in Russia based on hallway conversations with Russian scientists than we did through getting information from the intelligence communities.
These good back channels to getting facts and data to help everybody. Kat, who else do we have?
That was the only question from a subscriber that I saw in the chat, but I actually had a question that just popped in my mind. I'm wondering if there's any way that you see AI playing a part in how we bridge sort of like the national security and health intersection in terms of fighting against global health threats. I'm wondering if there's something in your brain that that I could pick to see if that's something that you see in the future.
Well, AI is a two-edged sword, right? Like all technology.
Mhm.
Ability to genetically engineer something has now been so democratized that you can buy a kit, you know, online for a few $1,000s and order pieces of various bits of DNA online through third-party commercial sources and create your own virus. That was done for horsepox, by the way, which is a close relative of smallpox, for $100,000 in a postdoc in Canada a few years ago. So you can create a bad virus without using AI, but AI just makes it easier. I mean, you can ask a question, you can do vibe coding, you can just ask random questions. How would you do this? How would you do that? And you can use language that would not necessarily prompt a AI company from seeing it as dangerous, and get answers to questions that you would have a very difficult time getting answers to otherwise. So there's a real threat. The problem is governance of AI is impossible. There are no incentives that I can think of for anybody to do too much oversight on AI. There's too much money involved. It's a revolutionary technology that's going to be taken up by every sector of society. And I think the risks of a bad person using AI to make a bad virus are significant. And I don't know what can be done about it.
Yeah.
It's a real conundrum.
So that goes back to what you were saying before. There has to be someone in like the National Security Agency to look at these issues to be sure that they constantly have their eyes and ears and their antennas up looking for some of those problems out there.
Right. And I think what's going to end up happening is because technology is so democratized, it's so widely available to people who are not necessarily even graduates in a biologic discipline. AI is going to make a lot of shortcuts for them. They're not going to have to do a postdoc at Harvard in order to learn how to do something not very savory with a biologic agent. Let's just hope that they don't want to do it, which raises the issue of intent, trying to figure out why people do bad things. And it's difficult to do.
It'll be interesting to see where we are in 5 to 10 years from now, because these things are changing at an exponential rate. I mean, 10 years ago to 5 years ago was a slower pace than 5 years ago to today, and it just keeps moving really quickly on some of these issues. I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning. What keeps you up at night? Like, what is your big worry? I meant to ask you that earlier.
You know, it's interesting. People want to know what's the big worry. What is it? Is it H5N1? Is it the bird flu? Is it anthrax? Is it, is it Russia dropping a smallpox bomb on someplace? No, I don't. That's not my big worry. My big worry is governments, both Democrat and Republican. This is not partisan at all. Letting the issue drop in between the crises. We need a vigorous and robust office and structure to deal with the next new threat, because we don't know what it's going to be. We can't just prepare like in the old days for your standard vaccines against, plague and smallpox and anthrax and drugs to treat tularemia and all of that. They may not be the next big threat. The next big threat may be genetically engineered using AI or not. And we need to be prepared to deal with any next threat, not just specific ones we think might happen. That's my big fear.
And that's
Dr. Z.
Yes.
I actually have one more question.
Oh, excellent. Let's hear it.
I'm going to bring up Joe.
Hey there. This is a pretty fascinating conversation, and so I was wondering. I would imagine that we have a pretty strong defensive and deterrence posture, especially when it comes to things like nuclear warfare, as a lot of people have been educated on these past 2 weeks. But my question is our deterrence posture for a biological weapon as strong as that, or what needs to change in order to prevent a state or even non-state actor from considering a biological weapon as a tool for attack?
Great question.
Yeah, it really is a good question. That you need to go work at the White House. I think that's a critical issue, and the problem is that we've signed the Biologic Weapons Convention, which basically prohibits the use of biologic agents in any warfare scenario whatsoever. But that doesn't stop bad people from breaking the rules. Chemical weapons have been used by Syria even after they signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. So what we've seen lately is there's been a normative prohibition against using biologic or chemical weapons that's been broken recently. Remember, the Russians have done assassinations using chemical weapons. Syria's used chemical weapons on their own people multiple times. And it's now becoming more normalized to use these weapons that have always been off the table. Now, biologic weapons are a bigger problem because they can infect not only the people you're attacking, but also blow back and potentially infect your own people as well. So they've been less likely to be used. But I think the global condemnation of their use, though that normative ban is fading. And I'm really worried that with biology, it's not like nuclear. In nuclear, as you notice, what they were attacking were the centrifuges, which were purifying uranium to make it weapons grade that could be used in a bomb. We don't have that problem with biology. Anybody with a laboratory can create, gallons of very dangerous stuff. They don't have to have centrifuges buried in a mountain. There's no one laboratory that we need to destroy to take out the threat of biologic weapons being used by China or Russia or Syria. So that's the big problem. Biology doesn't have a single choke point, that is a critical mass of fissionable material to stop. There are tens of thousands of laboratories that could create a biologic weapon around the world, and there's no way to really control that the way we control the creation of fissionable material.
So you have to have some trust in in looking out for the human condition and caring about everybody in some ways. Otherwise, you're going to set yourselves up for.
The approach to it is quite clear. The approach to it is you have to make it harder to develop a biologic weapon at every point in the development line, from getting access to the information, to getting access to the materials, to figuring out a way to distribute it, to, all the way along the line has to be hard. You have to make it harder and harder to do, so that by the time you have an idea to create a biologic weapon and you actually attack people with it, there's so many difficult steps that you can't quite get there. And that's been the approach to the US government, that peaks and wanes in between pandemics. It peaks during the pandemic and it wanes after the pandemic. And that's the major thing we need to stop.
And that's where your point was about making sure we don't let those windows of time have people where they let the issue lapse, and just stay focused on sort of the foot to the pedal all the time on this issue.
Exactly. And so in between, right now, we ought to have a group of people that are preparing for the next unknown pandemic like COVID, getting a vaccine ready in 100 days, preparing for production facilities to change from producing, say, measles vaccine to producing vaccine against this new stuff, getting all of that pre-prepared so that if the boot drops, we're prepared to deal with it and get countermeasures and prevention measures online as quickly as humanly possible.
Well, that's even in New York. I always think about this with the hospitals. We were really stressed during the COVID pandemic, but did all the hospitals, did everyone go back to the way they were operating before that at 98% occupancy? Are people ready for another problem if it were to occur, or were things put into place after the pandemic to be sure that there's a buffer built in there to handle another crisis, whether it's
well, you need to answer that question, Howard. You know that firsthand.
I know I'm not the commissioner anymore, but that was the big thing that I was thinking about during the pandemic, and said afterwards we need to be sure that the system is designed, that we have places, that we have the supplies, that we are manufacturing things in the United States, not elsewhere, because that was a big issue. We didn't have ventilators, we didn't have the supplies, everything was being was made elsewhere. So is the United States ready for that?
And that's the reason why we need this strong connection with the private sector. The United States doesn't make drugs and vaccines, at least very well. They don't make diagnostic kits very well either. And you may recall during COVID, the countries that did really well making kits to diagnose COVID initially were the countries that immediately had the kits made by the private sector and just paid them for them, whereas the United States lagged behind because we tried to do it as a government rather than the private sector. There are a lot of good places for the private sector, but they have to be prepared to move from what they're normally doing to deal with the crisis on a moment's notice, and that's what we haven't prepared for.
Public-private partnership in a lot of ways. Ken, thank you for joining today. Your knowledge, your vision, your whole perseverance is unbelievable. You really created the world of health security for the nation. So I will say on behalf of all Americans, I thank you for what you did starting 25 years ago. And it continues to this day, even if it does have the ups and downs, but the concept is still there today. And you're as inspirational and you're as candid today as you were back when we first met, which is wonderful. So I thank you. I appreciate you sharing all this information with us and recognizing what the nation needs to do to keep ourselves in the leadership role when it comes to national health security. That is it for our show today. Next time on Docology, we're going to hear from Dr. David Feigenbaum. He's an immunologist at the University of Pennsylvania, whose own struggle with a rare illness led him to find a treatment, and then that launched him into a journey where he's looked at how approved medicines can be used to treat other diseases that people have. But remember, if you're a Docology subscriber, you can join the conversation. You just need to sign up on the email reminders at docology.live or on Substack. And tune in next time, because the topic we cover may just save your life. Docology is a production of Hang Media. Our producer is Catherine Warren. Ronnie Selig is editorial advisor. Our creative director is Anna Richard. Janine Wilson of Wilson Media Group handles paid marketing. Our publicists are Leslie Ann Wade and Jerry Caracoli. Theme music was composed by Nick Kitts. Subscribe and join our community at docology.life. Until next time, move, wash your hands, and stay healthy.